Welcome to the Climate Hive Show. What do you solve? Where we sit down with global game changers on climate. My name is Kevin Trolet, aka Kedro, and I'm here with my co-founder and Climate Hive co-host, Mike Higgins, aka Higo. Our guest today is David Tulauskas, a seasoned sustainability leader with more than 30 years of experience helping some of the world's largest companies turn climate challenges into business opportunities. Today, he's principal in EY's climate change and sustainability service practice, where he works with organizations across manufacturing, mobility, and consumer sectors to drive sustainable transformation and long-term value creation. Before EY, David served as Chief Sustainability Officer at Blue Triton Brands and spent nearly 3 decades at General Motors, where he led global sustainability strategy and helped embed environmental thinking into core business operations. At EY, a global leader in professional services, David focuses on helping companies not just respond to climate change, but to use it as a catalyst for innovation, growth, and competitive advantage. So we're very excited to have you here, David. And to kick us off, I will turn it over to Mr. Higo to get us started.
All right, awesome. David, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Mike.
So as the namesake suggests, we're all about problem solving. So our first question is always the same, and it's, David, what do you solve?
What do I solve? So I guess, working for EY and as a consultant and an advisor at its core, I help organizations make better long-term decisions in a world, frankly speaking, that's changing faster than, our systems are designed for, whether that's climate, resources, or how value is created. And just for context, I spent 30 years saying I'd never be a consultant, but I feel really fortunate to have found myself amongst really family and friends that are all aligned around building a better working world. So, I really love focusing on value, and that means like driving value for companies, whether it's through working on compliance activities and taking that same data that a company needs for reporting purposes and identifying ways that it can use to inform key business decisions. So, for example, working with a clothing retailer with over 1,000 stores, helping them calculate their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Through that process, we found a lot of outlying stores where they were able to go and address the higher emission scenarios and situations and really help to lower their emissions and, importantly, lower their utility cost.
Well, that sounds like a win-win-win right there, because even beforehand, I was thinking about, things that I wanted to bring up and ask, and it really comes out of Green Biz, the show that Trellis put on last month that we came out of. And that question in my mind is, where does sustainability really create business value? And I think you may have already just answered my question.
Well, for many folks who don't think about that, I always try to put sustainability in terms that people can understand, especially people that don't work in sustainability. So for me, sustainability is a value driver, and that value can be measured either through top line growth, bottom line improvements, or reduce risks. And there's not one business leader that's going to argue with anything that can increase top line revenue, improve the bottom line, or reduce risks.
Yeah, that seems to be the triple threat right there, for sure.
David, I was going to ask, can you, because you've been at this for a long time, and I know one of the things we're very interested is working with big companies. But can you take us back a little bit? Like, how did you get to where you are? What's your, aha moments in your journey?
Yeah. So there are two moments really early on in my career where I realized there was a connection between what sometimes felt abstract and far away, like an oil spill, or very tangible, like lots of car exhaust and traffic accidents. And they have really, real environmental and human consequences. And for me, anyhow, once I saw that connection between business, the environment, and human consequences, like it's hard to unsee that. And so a couple aha moments for me. One, I grew up in Michigan. So for any listeners that are familiar with Michigan, northern Michigan is blessed with lots of, water and woods. And, so I grew up hunting, camping, fishing, hiking. And that was like one weekend. But I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan. And so on the other weekends, I was at my friends' garages trying to figure out how to get flames to come out of tailpipes. I mean, how
Nice.
ironic was that?
Yeah.
And I went to school to become a mechanical engineer to get into the automotive industry and figure out how to get more horsepower. And during that time, as my junior year, the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened. And seeing that pristine wilderness that I would just love to be in, and those animals, whether marine animals or shore animals, being significantly impacted, really had a visceral uh, effect on me. And so I committed myself to continuing my schooling to focus on becoming an environmental engineer and to figure out how to create a symbiotic relationship between the environment and the mechanical world. And then fast forward, I did get a job at General Motors, and one of my early assignments was as a plant engineer in Pontiac, Michigan. And our plant manager there, first day you started work there, he'd call you into his office and he'd give you his speech. And his speech was, from the minute you close your car door to the minute you open up the factory door, I want you thinking about how you're going to make a difference at General Motors. And for a young engineer, that was really motivating. And working at a plant, we were building pickup trucks where it was like, you know, a minute equaled millions of dollars, right? And revenue is critical to keep that line going. So it was really motivating, and that just became my MO. Every time driving to work, it's like, okay, what difference am I going to make at General Motors? Then fast forward, I spent 8 years in China working for General Motors. And, from the streets of Shanghai, here I am dodging cars, breathing in, car fumes. And it kind of hit me that my job is no longer to make a difference at General Motors, but to make a difference in the world through business. I mean,
Mm.
personal mobility has amazing, benefits, but it also has a lot of unintended consequences. So, for me, when you think about the Exxon Valdez oil spill, it was like, bam, hit me immediately. Really changing my mindset and understanding what my personal purpose is. That took, many years to sort of realize that business is my platform, and, my purpose is to drive impact, positive impact through business.
That Valdez disaster was, it's
I
still like it
remember that.
happened yesterday, you know?
Yeah, crazy.
So, full circle moment. My one of my three kids, our middle daughter, she's actually going to school in Valdez, Alaska, and we dropped her off in August last year, and was like full circle moment. I was like, man, this is where it all started.
That's
Yeah,
right.
so interesting. A life is like that, right?
Yeah,
Your
Mm.
full moment.
a lot of
You know,
reminders of what your purpose is and what you're intended to do.
are there a lot of reminders in Valdez? I know that's a total sidebar, but I mean, is it still present? You know, that disaster?
Yes, it
Yeah.
is. So, over 30 years, a number of species have rebounded, but there's still a number of species that have not rebounded since that oil spill. And there are places you can go around Prince William Sound where you turn over a rock and you can still see the oil, and certainly on the ocean floor as well. Yeah.
Man. You know, I'm listening to stories of General Motors, and I think of GM. GM's such a huge company, you know, so many moving parts, right? You know, you think about you got to make decisions as executives, and they're going to make decisions around sustainability, right? How does that happen inside of such large organizations? You know, and then how is that propagated?
Yeah, so there's generally a formal way, right, through op model and governance, where there's annual reviews and things like that. But there's also informal ways to you know drive impact and influence decisions. So I mean, certainly we had when I started up the sustainability group after the bankruptcy in 2011, I mean, we had three shareholders. We had the US government, we had the UAW, and we had the Ontario government. And so we knew that they expected a radically different amount of transparency from us. So some of the things are easy when you got real drivers. And in today's environment, regulations can be drivers for sustainability professionals to get things done. But I'll
Mm-hmm.
give you another example where sometimes, patience and persistence pays off. And so thinking about setting some big goals, we got a letter from our CEO, got a letter from a global NGO advising that, hey, there's a lot of commodities that are contributing to deforestation. And while the top five at the time didn't include sustainable natural rubber, it really was just a matter of time. And so I got an opportunity to really help form our opinion about that. And so long story short, what I realized is that it's less about the materials and it's all about reframing how people think about risk, resilience, and opportunity. And I'll kind of go back to talking about value. So when you're trying to influence business decisions, you got to be speaking their language, right? You got to
Mm-hmm.
align whatever you want to happen to their business priorities. And you need to make it a win-win. And most successfully, you make it their win and you don't get any credit. And that's okay with me. But this sustainable natural rubber opportunity was basically I worked with our procurement organization, our tire engineers, our quality engineers, and basically we went and traveled the latex value chain. We went to Malaysia to a rubber plantation to see how the latex trees were being tapped, how that latex was ultimately turned into rubber, and how tires were made. So we went from Malaysia to Thailand up to Japan, and I'll never forget, like the person that was in charge of buying 50 million tires a year said, "I will never look at another tire the same way." And so, we're you know, it's one thing to influence people's minds with data and kind of, drive that business case using the language that they understand. But there's another to impact their hearts through experiences. And that was one thing that has stuck with me is when you can, impact hearts and minds, you got them. And like, that's really transformative.
What were the insights on that trip? Because I mean, that sounds like an amazing thing. And then somebody who's
Mm-hmm.
buying 50 million, it's hard to think about 50 million tires a year. That's just wow. But what were the moments on that trip that were mind changers or heart openers for you
Yeah,
guys?
that's a great question. So one, um, tappers go out at night because that's when the latex comes from the leaves down into the trunk. And so you get the highest yield at night. These plantations are dangerous. I mean, there's snakes and there's other things that can hurt, harm, maim, these tappers as they go through tapping their trees. So that was one thing. Another thing is we met their families, right? We saw many plantations had schools. So we really saw how people lived. And so when you see people live that you rely on these 50 million tires, it definitely changes perspectives because they live differently than us. And again, the job is dangerous. The other thing is it's basically a cash business for like the first 2/3 of the value chain. And so how do you drive traceability and transparency if you can't follow the money?
Mm.
With through credits and payments and whatnot. You don't really start picking up invoices until tire companies actually pay for the big rubber blocks. And before that, everything's pretty opaque.
I'm curious how that translated then. You come back, how did that translate into changes at
Yeah.
GM?
So one, we were the first company to commit to sourcing tires with sustainable natural rubber. Problem was, there was really no definition of sustainable natural rubber. So we got a couple other OEMs and we got a number of other global NGOs and we got the European Car Industry Association. And we basically met on the sidelines of the Washington, D.C. Auto Show. And we talked about whether or not we're going to voluntarily, as an industry, make this commitment to sustainable natural rubber. So here's another point is to drive change, you don't need everyone to immediately change. You just need to create tipping points. And for us, that tipping point was, I forgot to mention, we had 11 tire manufacturers in there as well.
On
So
the
we didn't
trip.
have all of them. We didn't have
Yeah.
all the OEMs. We didn't have all the global NGOs, but we had enough to create a tipping point. And that became, or ultimately what came out of it was a global platform for sustainable natural rubber, which is an organization that are building the standards, are, defining what sustainable natural rubber is, developing the guidance and guidelines, and it's based out of Singapore and helping to avoid deforestation through sustainable natural rubber that's used in vehicles.
You think about a company as significant as GM, you take the supply chain all the way back. It's dependent on people going out at night to harvest sap from trees, probably with a manual process, right? So these giant, sophisticated corporations, reliant on people that are climbing trees at night.
Totally.
Isn't that
Another example, working at Nestle and Nestle Waters. I mean, we truly committed to increasing the use of recycled PET in our bottled water. Well, guess what? The companies that that buy the bales from the MRFs, and flake them and then sell them to the PET companies, they're mom and pop shops. And so when, and they're working on razor thin margins. I had a colleague that used to say, we're building a business with matchsticks and duct tape, right? Your chain is only as strong as your weakest link. And every business with a complex supply chain has one or more weak links. And that's, where sustainability can come in. And the work we do is to identify that, help to mitigate and address those and create more resilient supply chains. Just another example of some of the things we do here.
yeah, fascinating? You know, Previously when we were talking, you said something that really stuck out to me. You said waste is a resource at a place. I'm starting to, and I thought, wow, that's really something I wanted you to address because it was so profound, right? So when you say waste is a resource at a place, what does that really mean in the world that you're living in?
Yeah, so General Motors had a lot of factories that were landfill free. So they didn't send any waste to the landfill. And we were only able to get that to change people's mindsets about, this dirty rag, this, scrap cardboard, this, returnable container or whatever, is to look at this as not a waste, but as a resource just out of place. It is a valuable commodity. And so we
Okay.
really strive to, and stress, let's create new revenue streams from our waste streams. And that moves it from a waste to a valuable resource.
Yeah, that then really strikes me as the circular economy proposition, right? And I was thinking about tires and circular economy because there's so many uses for the tires once they've expired from the vehicles, right? Where they take the steel out of them, chop up the rubber, and they make all kinds of products out of the rubber.
Yeah.
So it's the
Yeah.
same thing.
And interestingly, at GreenBiz, we held a session on circular business models, and we had some great companies on the panel, and we were doing some audience engagement. And I asked the audience, "What is your biggest driver?" And I said, "Okay, let's get the elephant out of the room, with the first question. Who's working on circular business models because of extended producer responsibility regulations in the US?" And out of, I don't know, maybe 80, 100 people, like three people raised their hand. I was like blown away. I said, "Okay, who's working on, like," and we had asked who has a sustainable business model active today, who's working on it in the next 12 months. And I said, for those folks, what is the largest driver? And it was customer or consumer expectations. It was new revenue, top line revenue growth through circular business models. I mean, think about the apparel companies, working on repair, and fashion, where including my daughters, they trade their dresses online,
Yep.
and that's amazing.
I mean, what you're saying is also, we hear that a lot, is that the consumers are driving things. So whatever regulatory things that you have, there is demand, which sometimes, I think there's been sort of greenwash is a term, right? Or a green premium. And one thing we heard at Green Biz, and we've heard it with guests on our show, is that whatever anybody's doing, it has to financially make sense. And you've echoed that as well, that the business model has to be sound, because there's only a degree to which people will pay more, and then they can't, or they're not going to. But maybe on the other side of that, there's demand. And so the demand for things to be circular, or a value placed on things, that are done in a more circular fashion, creates value for companies where they can dip into that. Do you think
Yeah,
that's true? Is that kind of
I
what you're getting at?
I do, but purchasing something that has a cost of hundreds of dollars, and paying a premium of say 10% on that is different than something that costs $2.79 a cleaner, that versus its competition at $2.50.
Mm,
People are buying that $2.79 cleaner with like label certifications and sustainably marketed attributes all the time. And there's a lot of evidence. But unfortunately, they do, it just depends on the category, the product, and the purpose, right? But I would say for the most part, most consumers, when price, technology, performance, quality is all equal, they
Yep.
absolutely will pick something that they think, whether it's because it's on the label, something they read, someone told them something, that if it has more sustainable attributes than the other, they'll buy that one. And that's a powerful statement when working with clients and the sustainability people that we work with, trying to influence their leadership, is making sure that they've got that business case built around consumer expectations. And we just had a roundtable in our office here in Detroit, and we had a number of auto parts and automakers here, and it was great to hear that despite the uncertainty of today's environment in which we operate, they are still getting asked by their customers and or investors on how they are becoming more sustainable, even even especially from financing, right? So one company talked about having a green bond about 5 years ago. It was coming to expire, and this person said, I fully went into the meeting expecting that that won't be a requirement for renewal, and it absolutely was. So they are lowering their cost of capital by performing better around climate attributes, GHG emissions.
So
Mm.
one of the things that we talked about before that is related to this, but it's again more from where you sit and your visibility, is moving things in a big organization, because you have this unique experience where you've been in, and now you're dealing with also big organizations, but you've been in these big organizations. Can you talk about the difference of making change in a big organization when maybe everybody's not on board, or and then also compared to what your understanding is for smaller organizations
Yeah.
when we're talking.
So, for big organizations, what's really cool is you can just make a little tiny incremental change and have significant impact. If you can establish some supplier requirements that um, starts them on their reporting and disclosure journey, and through that, they start to focus on, energy as a cost and start to improve their bottom line, you've just made significant impact there. Um, the bigger impact ones generally come around less frequently, driven by new business models and opportunities and new products. And
Hmm.
but every company has sort of a recipe book on how they make their product or their service, how they provide their service. And as a sustainability professional, you should be intimately aware of that process and those practices and work with the key stakeholders that own that part and just figure out how to make incremental, tweaks to it that drive measurable change and help them continue to meet their business priorities. And so I spent most of my time at General Motors just trying to make those little incremental changes. It was evolution, not revolution. There were things like sustainable natural rubber that presented itself that, you could argue that was transformative and revolutionary for ultimately for the industry. That's great, but not that doesn't work all the time. I'll give you another example. One of the best meetings of my life. It lasted 9 minutes. So I mentioned that GM had a number of facilities that were designated as landfill free. And I was hoping that we could get the organization to commit that all of its factories would be landfill free. And so I made an appointment with the global head of manufacturing, and I was getting a lot of resistance at mid-level management. We can't do it, it won't be supported, blah,
Mm.
blah, blah. We can't, best practices here don't necessarily translate to best practices there. So I went into his office and, I just said, hey, here's the situation. I would love to have General Motors be a leader in this space. You know, Here's another thing is companies can't be a leader in everything. They got to identify what are the 1 to 3 areas where they really want to lean in, be a leader, use that to differentiate and drive value. And so that was one where we clearly were leading the industry in landfill-free facilities, driven by really years of mindset change. But so I just said, hey, um, this is what I'd like to do, and I'd like your support. And he said, all right, listen, I don't want to we'll add this to their scorecards, but I want to make it voluntary because when you make it mandatory, people can start doing funny things. So what we'll do is we'll add, basically a gold star on their, plant scorecards. If they're voluntarily meeting landfill free, they're going to get a gold star. Well, guess what happened? Within 6 months, plant managers saw the other plant having a gold star and goes back to his team and says, hey, they got a gold star. Why don't we have a gold star? And using that competitive nature of manufacturing just really drove the adoption of landfill free across our whole organization without making it mandatory. And then once we did it, we made it mandatory to keep it and we measured the value that was driven by it.
I'm listening to the stories of sustainability. I love the story about the zero waste. Initially I had this thought of what people would do is everybody has to take a little trash home in their pockets, but maybe that's not the case. There, but I was thinking about that in terms of headwinds. Headwinds around sustainability, and is it your experience that one of the headwinds is a perception that sustainability is a cost center? Is that a headwind that you see?
Yeah, it is today. It wasn't always like that. I would say from a, sustainability profession, just in general, a lot of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, has already been addressed. And we're getting many companies are at a place where like things need to be innovated and invented to help them get over that plateau of their emissions, for example.
Hmm.
Um, and and then, certainly it's a really uncertain environment for companies today. And first thing companies do in times of uncertainty is generally look to to cut cost,
Right.
to help them, manage their cash flow and, prepare for when it gets better. And so sustainability right now is just basically moving back to where it started from, and that is proving out the business case that there is a win-win-win. There is the triple bottom line. There is a financial benefit to this. And frankly speaking, it's a good reset that's happening within the sustainability profession. We, in general, had it pretty good, for a number of years, and leadership was defined by ambition. and commitments. And there were a lot of companies out there that were willing to commit to some really ambitious targets out there. But in today's environment, it's all about action and performance and progress and less about ambitions. It's like matters, how are you improving every day? And so, yeah, the headwind is not necessarily, it's a headwind everyone's dealing with. Like there's a
Right.
cost of capital, right? And so if a company only has $10 to spend and there's 20 projects, it's going to spend it on what gets the best ROI. And so sustainability professionals really need to roll up their sleeves. They need to, lean into their business acumen and help develop compelling business cases that get approved.
Yeah, we heard a lot of this. I mean, at Green Biz, we were really, in the interviews that we were doing, and we're hearing this message, right? Like loud and clear. It's like here's how you deal with headwinds, and even the rooms were like how CSOs can be impactful. We're full. I mean, they were like just full. Like, how do you talk? But I wanted to actually ask if we could shift a little bit too and talk about what you're doing now at EY, and because I think it's super interesting. We're not just talking about sustainability, but we're talking about resilience. So it's not just about companies being able to, let's say, make a more, profitable and eco, friendly, climate friendly, products, but actually the world is changing, and you had some very good things to say, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in the work that you're doing now.
So, um, again, helping people change their mindsets and really understand the value. I mean, you mentioned resilience. That was a really clear word that came out loud and clear during Green Biz as a new narrative in how to talk about sustainability. Um, and why? Why is that? It's because, resilience helps to ensure that companies, minimize or mitigate disruptions in their supply chain so they can continue to operate. That's again, what business leader is going to argue against doing something that makes their supply chain more resilient? Um, Another topic, water, is definitely starting to climb up on the radar screens, get in the radar screens of companies. It's quietly becoming a more material issue. Um, and, I heard from a number of folks like water stewardship more seems like a nice thing to do, whereas water security seems like a must
Mm,
thing to do. And so
right.
Hmm.
just changing the way sustainability professionals talk about things in the business, in their company, can really change the way people view sustainability.
Yeah, because I think you had made this point about, future proofing that companies need to actually, that's what resilience it means, is like you're going to be able to face what's coming, right?
Yeah. Well, I, you know, it's saddens me, to be honest, that there's really no non-radical futures that we're moving toward. Whether you look out to 2030 or 2040 or 2050, I mean, um, we're sort of past the point where we've got a chance. Now, companies need to continue to mitigate toward a 1.5 degree world, but they need to plan for a 3 degree world. And that's about being resilient, about future proofing. You know, Everyone at EY, including myself and many other people, are out there all trying to make sure that we stick as close to a 1.5 degree world. And the reason why that's important is because the effects of climate change are least if we can keep it to 1.5 degrees.
Hmm.
The interesting thing is this is 1.5 degrees on average across the world, but the world isn't warming at an equal rate. I think the last
Right.
time I checked, continental Europe is already at 2.5 degrees. So we are seeing those disruptions and those impacts from physical risks, and we're seeing policy changes to transitional risks to companies. So companies that don't think about this stuff are putting the future of their company at risk, at peril, certainly future revenues. And the companies that can, again, work towards mitigating their emissions, preparing their suppliers to play a role in that, are more resilient. They're able to withstand, they're better planned, they're better prepared for a changing world. Listen, this isn't about predicting what the future is actually going to look like. It's just understanding it's going to look differently than it is today. Extreme heat is already impacting companies. It's changing people's behavior. And it's no longer again, like a national thing. We're seeing it in new geographic locations. And so many companies have sort of built their business continuity planning around a baseline that's no longer relevant. With all these incremental changes, the baseline has gone up. So the peaks and valleys of these extreme events are getting more. And they're prepared for, they've based their business plan resilience on a baseline that is no longer, relevant. It's changed. And so companies need to change with that. And again, it's when companies can think about how to plan for a 3-degree world, they're better positioned to thrive in that world, be successful, have the products and services that people need and want in our changing world.
It brought up a fascinating thing. I just remembered is Champagne, France, where they grow the grapes for champagne, right? The heat index there is changing the dynamic of the grape, right? And what's happening is the optimum band for growing those types of grapes is actually moving north. I don't know if you saw that. And to a point where, a lot of those manufacturers actually purchase land in the UK because it's moving where that area could become a future place for those grapes to grow. And I thought that might have just been the most fascinating example of impact of change to me is to think about climate moving, right? Where it used to be beautiful
Coffee.
and it's
Yeah.
moving.
Coffee is moving up to higher altitudes, right? It's changing where it's grown. Barley, where it's expected to be readily available and plentiful, is not going to be in Scotland anymore for single malt scotch. It's going to be elsewhere.
I was wondering also, David, can you give like some examples just in the work you do when companies do prepare for resilience? What does that conversation look like? What do they what do they do if they don't know what things are going to look like other than obviously they're going to be hotter, but what are some of the words of wisdom you give to these companies?
Yeah, so couple examples. One is an apparel company, small. They just forever. August 8th is when they changed their inventory over in their stores, and was talking to that company, and they're like, "Yeah, we sent a bunch of wool sweaters to New York City, our largest market, on August 8th." And the first cold day was like November 2nd.
Hmm.
So for all that time, nobody's thinking about buying wool sweaters. And that's lost opportunity. So often it comes down to like just business planning and forecasting. And again,
Mhm.
what's right, the timing for what's right in New York, is not necessarily going to be the same time for LA or Seattle. And so companies need to stop thinking about national markets and like improve their granularity and fidelity. And often this what we're finding now is the challenges are goes well beyond the sustainability team. Sustainability team is generally you know the the organization that's sort of like raising the red flag and convening different functions to come together and think about these challenges in new and different ways. Um, Another example of a very large global company and doing a climate and nature risk assessment. And what's interesting is you can, we started at a top-down perspective, and that's generally the best practices, using the tools and the models available, and you identify hotspots. But to put in place efficient mitigation actions, you really now need to go bottoms up and you need to like, okay, boots on the ground, what's really happening? You need to validate that it actually is a risk and you need to start building solutions that are relevant for those areas, whether, it's wheat in one place or cocoa in another place or coffee in another place is what is happening again is that's why sustainability just gets the ball rolling. But one of the biggest challenges is operationalizing this. So getting people to sign up, get on board, and start rolling up their sleeves and working on this. So that's a big challenge that we're working with companies on just how to operationalize this, how to take it from high level strategic point of view and have it manifest at the front lines or on the factory floors. And
Yeah.
you talked about. I want to come back to small companies because you'd asked that a little bit earlier. I know you've got a lot of listeners that represent small companies. Um, there's there's nothing that big companies are doing in this space that smaller companies couldn't be doing, shouldn't be doing. But what is generally different is they haven't established those years of processes and those mindsets and those practices. So they actually, small companies should really see sustainability as a huge advantage to reimagine their business. They're in a constant state of transformation, right? They're trying to move from startups to stable companies. And what happens is when companies become stable, they no longer think they're in a transformation mode. But we just talked about things why
Yeah.
companies need to constantly be thinking that they're in a transformation of some sort. And I think small companies have a huge advantage to be a disruptor, to be a first mover. Most big companies, it doesn't pay to be a first mover, but they're a really powerful, fast follower.
Well, David, we have so much more to talk about and explore with you, and we just so much appreciate your perspective and the ability to have this conversation. It's really for the show. I think it's the first time we've talked with somebody that's worked with organizations on the level and for the length of time that you have. So um, we've kind of run to our time, but I just want to thank you so much for being on the show and can't wait for people to hear this conversation. I think it's really important, the work that you're doing.
It's a pleasure to be here. Clearly, I love talking about this stuff. And every business needs to be thinking about it. So happy you guys are talking about it, creating this community to really focus on what people solve for and amplifying their works and helping to influence and inform others in this space.
Thank you, David Tulauskas, our guest today, who is the principal at EY Climate Change and Sustainability Service Practice, and he works with organizations across manufacturing, mobility, customer sectors, and he's been at it for quite some time. So we look forward to continuing this conversation. And thanks so much.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Mike.